as we steer our community forward. And so when you have the value of women at this level, here's another 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. How is it that we can account for such high rates then of intimate partner violence if women are respected and women are the primary victim survivors of IPV, right? So I'm just raising these questions that are based on these traditional practices and belief systems. And then it goes on here, right? We all know Inafa Malik is probably the one value that's most immediately recognized as being CHamoru, and Inafa Malik represents not just getting along and harmony, but interdependence, working together, hand in hand for what's in the best interest of our communities. And so you can see that when you have disharmony in a family, there's no Inafa Malik, right? And the ultimate manifestation here, as I shared earlier, when I had a false start, is that even embedded in our language, in the CHamoru language, in Ifinota, is what is called vowel harmony. And that is that within a word, we need to ensure that there is harmony in the number of vowel sounds, right? So I was in a CHamoru language class earlier this week, and Auntie Loling Sauter was saying that, that's such an example of the degree to which we really are about maintaining that Inafa Malik in society, which really, if we were to put it in a Western context and look at it in a theoretical frame, is talking about I'm sorry, hang on. All of a sudden I lost my train of thought, but it's talking about homeostasis, right? And balance of all factors. And so looking more specifically at family violence, here is the definition taken straight out of our Family Violence Act of 1998. And so it's here on the slide. You can read that on your own. Okay, you can find that, of course, at the legislature's website. And so family violence occurs at different levels here in our community and throughout the Marianas, right? And so we're going to look at numbers not just for Guahan, but also for the CNMI. And so first looking at domestic violence, looking at intimate partner violence, we see across these 3 years, 2016, 2017, 2018, included kidnapping, intimidation, simple assault, and aggravated assault. We see that clearly all these numbers are raw numbers. They're not interpreted to say a whole lot, but we do know that it exists. And we know that, as a small island community, there's close to 1,500 cases. Looking at the Guam Statistical Yearbook 2017, everything on this slide, there's nothing unusual about it. Okay, there's nothing to question here on this slide. Pacific Islanders make up about 81.3 to 85.5% of perpetrators. Okay, that's not that surprising when you look at the percentage of our population, right? And then we've got the Guam Stop Violence Against Women primary data collection that shows CHamoru's comprise 32% of victims of violence and 30% of offenders. Again, there's nothing shocking there because CHamoru's comprise roughly 32-33% of our larger populations. That's no red flags there. And then when we look at perpetrators, the majority are male. That's very consistent, national data sets and internationally, and that females perpetrate about 1/4 to 1/3, depending on which data sets you use. So again, you see what's consistent with what's happening across the world in looking at domestic violence. Looking more specifically at child abuse numbers, here's data from CPS between 2012, 2017. Again, this is just showing that child abuse occurs, right? It's just raw numbers. The number, while you look at this and you look at and compare 2012 to 2017, you will think, wow, as a community, we're faring well. The numbers are going down, and it's tempting to do that. But the reality is closer to 2012 was at a time when there was a case that was adjudicated of a school personnel for not reporting. And so that kind of led to this major inflation in the reporting of cases. And so I think that accounts for that high number there. But if you look at the numbers from 2015, 2016, 2017, you see that, perhaps there is, and certainly now with the COVID situation, the cases are astronomical. As a matter of fact, I ran into Lydia Diaz-Tenorio, who's the retired administrator of CPS a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the numbers in this, the most recent numbers. And she was saying that she doesn't know how, with the existing resources that they have at CPS, that they would ever be able to keep up with that increase in the number of cases. This table here is more CPS numbers, and this looking also at the same time frame, 2013 to 17, and just breaking down by type of abuse, right? So we know that our kids, our families experience all of these forms and types of abuse. Most common is going to be, depending on the year, but what we see is typically it's going to be physical abuse. Sexual abuse cases are usually about half of that number. Emotional abuse numbers are always usually high, and it's usually reported secondary to either physical or sexual abuse. And then we see neglect, physical neglect, and we see that that certainly has a very more recent increase in the numbers, and that's something to look at, right? 2016, 2017, compared to the 200 ranges, we're now in the 1,000 range, and compared to 2013 to 2014. And we know where there's abuse, there's stress, right? When there's stress, there's abuse. And so you can look at that. And of course, other confounding factors such as drugs and alcohol. And in the case of what's happening now, economic instability because of COVID. So looking at this next table, also CPS numbers, the first is the referrals involving alcohol abuse. So we know that alcoholism continues to be an issue, but perhaps what's even more common now is the opioid epidemic, as well as ICE, right? If you question whether or not ICE is an issue on Guam, watch any nightly news, and you will see almost every single story is somehow the ICE story. If it's for robbery, if it's for abuse, right? The ICE story finds its way into every single news broadcast for months and months and years at this point. So those factors, are not causal in terms of family violence, but certainly confounding that leads to the increases. This fourth table is our APS numbers, and this is one that shows significant cause for concern. Looking at numbers between 2016, 2017, 2018, broken down by ethnicity, which is very hard to find in the data, which is why that's all I've been able to share with you. It's because that's all we have. But this data by APS, Adult Protective Services, breaks down and shows that CHamoru's 67% or 69% in each of these 3 years as the number of cases, primarily for neglect and financial and property abuse. And so financial and property abuse is the most common type of abuse that our elders experience here on Guahan. And again, the inconsistency of this major overrepresentation, because if we comprise roughly 30% of the total population, we should also comprise roughly 30% of the problem. But here what we see is more than double in terms of elder abuse, which is very problematic and inconsistent with our traditional values. Okay, now shifting over to look at what's happening in the CNMI, same deal, all we have is raw numbers, and these are just number of cases. So the CNMI population collectively hovers around 100,000. Okay, so it's less than us by almost half, but you can see how much bigger our numbers are in contrast to the CNMI numbers. And that's for varying reasons, right? Looking at their abuse and neglect type by island, you see that this data was actually pulled from a newspaper article. It's the only data that was available, and it was of 2018. And so you see that all islands are impacted by child abuse. And then we see the allegations by type of abuse in the CNMI for that same year, right? So physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, same kind of trajectory that we see with us, except what is noteworthy is to see that physical abuse and sexual abuse are almost equal in terms of the number of cases, which is different from us. And so let's turn to look and see. So we know, I mean, we're social workers. We know the problem is real. There's no question about it. But as we try to understand it, as I was saying, and being self-reflective, particularly if you are Chamorro of Pacific Islander descent, right, Micronesian, what have you, then we want to see, well, let's try to get a deeper understanding of what's happening. And so the literature helps to point us in some direction. And so this here is a quote. I'm going to share with you a lot of quotes for the next few slides. And so this first one here is by a participant in a study that was conducted in the early 2000s. We have social worker Pete Roberto was part of this study, as well as Ian Twaddle, who's a faculty in the psychology program at UOG. It was published in 2002, 2003. And this female says, 38-year-old woman from my team, she says, I think there's a lot of spouse abuse in my community. And I think a lot of that stems from changes in the ancient Chamorro culture. Women used to be in control. They were the ones everyone respected. Somewhere along the line, something changed, and now it's the man who acts as the master of the house. If they feel you're not in control in the house, they react by thinking, if I smack you a little harder, maybe you will notice that I am in control. Okay, very well articulated by this woman. So when we look at the concept of historical trauma, I just wanted to share an operational definition here that is offered by Braveheart, who is Native American in the US context. And so Braveheart defines historical trauma as a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, including the lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma, right? So wherever there's massive group trauma, right? And that's what we have experienced as a collective community. And there's the psychological wounding that is coupled with that. And it's intergenerational. So it's not just about the people that are actively experiencing the traumatic event, but it's the transmission of that same trauma intra-psychically within that person onto the generations to come. You know, there's the study now of what's called epigenetics that looks at how is it possible that, you know, even if you didn't experience certain things, you manifest certain characteristics, and historical trauma is one way to understand and a conceptual framework by which to look at that. And so Evans Campbell shares 3 criteria that defines historical trauma. First, it was experienced by many people. Next, there were high levels of stress that was generated from that experience. And the third is that outsiders perpetrated the event with destructive intent. And ultimately that it has impact to the individual, the family, and the larger community. And clearly when you consider our history of colonization, that, just to be clear, has not been resolved, that we continue to live every single day, then you can see how collectively we as a people are incredibly wounded. Gern from Canada shared and highlighted the experience of the Indigenous women in Canada, where Gern shared they were twice as likely to experience intimate partner violence as compared to the non-Indigenous women. Their incarceration rates of Indigenous people was much overrepresented, with them being only 3% of the population, but comprising 27% of incarcerated people in 2 consecutive years. Of those who were incarcerated, 50% had reported experiences of family violence as children. And we know, and that's, you know, evidence of the intergenerational component of family violence, right? That behavior is transmitted, and practices and coping and genes, right, with epigenetics. And so you see that, you know, when you've experienced the colonization and it doesn't get corrected, there's no justice, there's no remediation, it continues to intensify from generation to generation. Murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Canada, they as a group were 12 times more likely to get killed or go missing as compared to other ethnic groups in the country. This is an example where my subtitles cover my slides, so I can't see what's under there, but you know, this is not a good state of affairs for Indigenous women. And this issue is repeated in many other Indigenous communities in the context of different countries. One of the times I was at the United Nations, I was at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the UN, and there was an intervention that were being made by Indigenous women specifically for this issue, to say, as a global community, we need to examine this because this is not okay. And so when we look at our Guam context, the historical trauma experiences that we've had, our ongoing colonization certainly is at the top of my list, because we can't be so quick to dismiss this. Just because we live comfortably in our homes and we think we have this great Western life does not mean that you have that you have equal rights as an Indigenous person or as anyone living on Guahan, right? The fact that we don't vote for a president, you know, is a very big problematic thing, because that's just one principal example of so many other dimensions of how we as a territorial possession of the United States are treated poorly, right? And so our ongoing colonization, we have experiences of World War II. You know, every July as a community, we process this trauma to some degree and celebrations around quote unquote Liberation Day. But our people suffered very significant trauma as a result of that. Many CHamoru families will tell you that the elders do not speak of the war because it is so taboo and so painful, right? And so what happens to that pain and where does it get placed? It gets placed in their behavior, it gets placed in their words, it gets placed in their bodies, right? High incidences even of diseases oftentimes are a manifestation of the experience of trauma. We have high risk for poverty. Another ongoing presentation right now is on the homelessness problem. And, I'm 50 years old. In my lifetime, I've seen Guam go from having absolutely no homeless to now having, several thousand homeless, right? So it's a real problem. And we experience structural racism. I work at the University of Guam, very structurally racist entity in which to be employed. And you can see that replicated. We can't fool ourselves to think that because brown people are the majority of the population on our island, that we don't suffer the malady of white privilege, because we do, but we're so desensitized to it because when we look around the room, we see brown people like ourselves. But when we start to challenge ourselves to deconstruct the experience and to deconstruct the power structures around us, then we start to see, geez, there's racism in my own life, even here in Guahan, where we tend to feel protected from that. There's land dispossession, right? Chamorro Nation is very noted for having done a lot of work around the return of ancestral lands. I have a cousin that just recently got employed on the base, and we go walking, and so we're always talking, and he's not very decolonized. And so he was talking about, well, they protested and they did this and they did this. And I said, can you imagine? Because he lives at home, of course, in ancestral land. I said, can you imagine if somebody came up to your house and said, sorry, we need your land, you got to go, and gave you about 5 chickens to compensate you for that? I'm like, how would you feel? Right? And that's what happened to so many of our people. And then to add insult to injury, the land sat for decade after decade after decade after decade unused, yet they experienced the problems of disconnection from their land, right? So that land dispossession creates lots of issues. And so that's why when we've got the Department of Defense wanting more and more acres, more and more expansion of militarism, it's very problematic for a lot of people that are decolonized and that are in the process and that understand our history, right? The banning of the language. The late Senator Angel Santos used to say that the indigenous language is the voice of the indigenous soul, right? It is from our native languages that we are able to most comfortably, or should be most comfortably, be able to articulate and express our soul, right? So when you take away this language and this voice of an expression, and replace it with something else, something happens to the host, right? Something happens to the people, and we see that clearly. And the demonization of traditional spirituality, right? Tautomonas, oh, wow, that's evil. That's, we need to burn our palm because we don't want to be contaminated by all this evil demonization, whereas those are just our ancestors. There's nothing to be afraid of, right? But with the role of westernization, to some degree Catholicism, it's been a real assault on traditional culture. And so consequently, you end up with identity and role confusion, right? And of course, probably the most damaging in terms of looking at gender dynamics among Chamorros is the introduction of patriarchy. Okay, and so we have on Guahan what I call the formula for family violence, right? Very clearly, it's very clearly laid out. We have the historical experiences of colonization, World War II, land dispossession, poverty, and the introduction of patriarchy. And that combined with your confounding factors of ongoing colonization, substance use disorders, poverty, abuse history, limited educational attainment, youthful parenting, and you're going to get family violence, right? I mean, it's a high propensity, not 100% all the time, but these are the factors that tend to lead to that. Some may remember Dr. Pat Timinglow. She's actually still on island, just retired from DOC not too long ago. In 1998, her dissertation, she focused on intergenerational trauma. And she's quoted as saying that the intergenerational transmission of historic community trauma affecting Chamorros, and indicated that such experiences pose mental health concerns, clearly, right? And she's a psychologist. She was able to show that in the data and to interview therapists who worked specifically with Chamorro populations. Braveheart, who defined historical trauma earlier, reported that the prevalence of high psychiatric disorders among American Indians, Alaska Natives living on reservations is rooted in the experience of collective, communal, and generational trauma that manifests today as racism, oppression, and discrimination. Native Americans in the US context are very clear about this point. There's nothing revolutionary about this idea that Braveheart is stating here, right? And that's why in our keynote address with Dr. Bonnie Duran, she just laid it all out so unapologetically, right? Clearly, oh, this is because of this. This is just the way it is. And the best way to treat our people is to use our culture to do so, right? And so we don't need to tiptoe around these realities. As a matter of fact, you know, I've been talking about cultural competency for at least 20 years in the NASW conferences, right? Our conferences are so imbued with it. But the challenge really becomes, how do we take that knowledge and how do we fit it and intersperse it on top of our treatment modalities in working with our client systems? Because when we do, that's when we see positive outcomes in our work. Okay, and so continuing to move on here, Manggåfa, this is the Hadza word for the family. And so here's a quote from Dr. Robert Underwood, who describes the family and its various manifestations throughout Micronesia is the unit that traditionally has kept society intact, responsive and responsible to change. Micronesians, by an overwhelming majority, see families as the basic building blocks of society. Moreover, they tend to see each other not as individuals, but with particular professions or personalities, but as people from certain families. This family orientation is healthy and necessary for their continued survival as Micronesians, for it is in the family context that most serious discussions occur and most decisions are made. So Dr. Underwood is reminding us here how central the family is in terms of who we are as Chamorros, right? And you know, on island or off island, when you meet people that you don't know, it doesn't take long before you start to say, who's your family? What village are you from? What's your clan name? Who's your grandma? Right? I find myself asking people that more and more, who are your grandparents, right? Because I'm getting older. But that's part of our very relational function in terms of consistent with our traditional practices of identification through our clans. What traditional role did women play? So we know women, you know, as there is the Magalahi, there is the Magahoga, and the male and female chiefs were not husband and wife, they were brother and sister, right? So we see the primacy of the Tsetla relationship. We know that there was the matrilineal line. Land was transmitted along your mother's line, which meant women were very powerful because, as I said earlier, as Pacific Islanders, our land, we are land. Land is us, right? Land feeds us, it's our mother, it takes care of us. And so when women are the ones that are the caretakers of the land and that it's transmitted, you can see exactly how powerful women were in society. Hence the matricentric and matrifocal components, right? Women were given lots of special powers. For example, not only were we revered for our childbearing abilities, but the ownership of the children were seen to be that of the woman, right? Because we literally physically birthed the children. So while fathers, of course, had rights and roles, they were seen as property of the women. And then we have a lot of this stuff embedded in the legend of Punten and Fortna, right? Which is our creation chant. I'm sorry, creation legend. And because we're on a time crunch, because I had a false start and we had to take a bit of time, we're not going to listen to this representation of our legend, but you can, there is one on Guampedia that you can watch. And basically, in a nutshell, it really highlights the primacy of the sibling relationship and the creator goddess and the Inafa Maulik between Fu'una or Fortna and her brother Ponten, right? So she was the creator. It was not the man who created humanity. It was the woman. It was Fortna who created, right? And she did so in unity and in complementarity, not with a husband or with her spouse or with her lover, but with her brother, right? So again, you see the primacy of that relationship. Tanya Mendiola from Guampedia, she shares, and I love this because while we see the significant role that women played in society, we as women cannot confuse ourselves or anyone else for that matter to think that we had more power or authority over men. What really existed in the relationship was a gender balance between the role of women and men. And so Tanya Mendiola in her piece describes this very well, and I'll quote, Chamorros were able to find a societal equilibrium as both men and women, the eldest brother and sister, were co-equal guardians and administrators of clans and their resources, right? So by no means do we say that as a matrilineal society, or as one that is matrocentric or matrifocal, that men don't play a part or that men don't have power, because that would be deluding ourselves, right? I've actually had interest by Gloria Steinem. I don't know if you folks have heard of her, but she's like the queen of the American feminist movement, wanting to inquire more about Chamorro culture, because she had heard that we had a female governor and a female supermajority of women in our legislature, and she wanted to know what is happening there, because the women, you know, it's a feminist model. And I wrote back to her, and I gave her some citations, and I shared with her, we are absolutely respectful of women, but it doesn't mean women have more power, right? Whereas, so it's a very contrast from the US kind of patriarchal versus feminist model in terms of power structures, whereas ours is more complementary. I skipped one. So now we're looking at the old accounts, right? And so one that is referenced a lot, because he really described traditional Chamorro culture, is Freycinet. And so this was published in 2003, but he wrote it in 1898. He was a French person that came into the Marianas. And so he wrote, the role of Chamorro women is having, quote, the direction of public affairs in their hands. At homes, they were absolute mistresses and had the command of everything. Nothing was done without first obtaining their opinion or consent, right? So this idea of absolute mistresses, right? They were absolute mistresses and had complete command of what was happening. I think for a Westerner, during that time frame, it must have been pretty hard to watch women being so empowered, the way that he saw when he came and encountered our Chamorro culture. And so I think that's largely where this kind of description is coming from. But again, we're putting focus in understanding traditional roles, because it helps us to look at and to troubleshoot how, as social workers, then do we work with this family where violence is a problem, where violence is problematic, right? So next quote, this is from Russell, who is author out of CNMI. He wrote a book in 1998, Tempu na Manggåfa, and he states, it is clear from these accounts that while the men may have been the warriors and navigators, the women were the heads of household and were quick to assert their prerogatives. For instance, the husband did not dare give an order contrary to his wife's wishes, nor punish the children, for she would turn upon him and beat him. Now, I put this, on the one hand, as women, we celebrate, yes, this shows we had our power, we had our authority, but the two words in this quote that's really significant for purposes of our exploration here is the last two words, right? Would turn upon him and beat him, right? So this is an indication here of the abuse that's happening from the woman who's the head of household, who had that prerogative to beat her spouse or her partner. So just something to put at the back of our minds. But women being in the position as head of household is so interesting in our Western modern context, because most families would say that the father is the head of household. However, when you ask who makes the decisions, who holds the purse strings, who really has those factors that are variations of influence and power, you'll see that most families, it is in the woman, the Chamorro woman or the mother's influence. Power and authority. And so looking further at women's central role, Dr. Sauter and Tiloling, from her book, Daughters of the Island, which was published, I believe, in the early 80s, states, and I quote here, females, particularly elder women of the clan who were married and mothers, were powerful in all spheres of society. Through the matrilineal kinship system, women exercised control over family life, property, and inheritance. They assumed a central role and possessed strong bargaining power in their marriage. Their esteemed status was also reflected in rituals, legends, and ceremonial events. Right? So, all of these are just reinforcing the idea. And so how do we use this when we work with our client systems, right? I mean, when you work with women, especially those who have suffered intimate partner violence and abuse, you can remind them of their power, right? That we come from a tradition where women, that idea, the Western concept, fix your crown, right? This kind of knowledge and imparting this kind of history and backfilling a lot of what colonization has taken away in terms of knowing about themselves, in terms of identity, really helps to reconstitute and help them as they move forward in their lives. And, consistent with this idea that I shared earlier, that it's not even an idea, it was our practice, that was that of balance in our relationship with men. Freycinet shares a number of things that I wanted to share in terms of complementu, right? So when we talk about the relationship between the husband and wife, or the man and the woman in relationships, I often refer to it as complementarity. And so the word in CHamoru is complementu. So when we look at some practices, these were practices that Freycinet shares to complementu the role of the father. So he shares that when a child of status was born, rice was thrown at the feet of the father as a sign of respect. Right. In addition, children's names were also based on the talents of their fathers, as in the case of Nineti, or ingenious, and Taiokna, which is intrepid. And so more of Freycinet, same book, he addressed the sanctity of the union of marriage, describing the infidelity of marital partners. And he states, quote, "An adulterous woman who had been repudiated by her husband and sent back to her mother's house after judgment was stripped of her possessions at the same time, but he was perfectly free to avenge himself upon the seducer for the insult given, even to the point of killing him." And again, the last two words of the quote, right? Killing him. This is violence, right? So even though we describe this peaceful society, violence is still there, right? And these are very early descriptions of that. And this, of course, in the context of adultery, in the context of a marital relationship. Now, moving on to look at our children in the ancient accounts, or the early, not ancient, but early accounts in terms of our interactions with our children as parents. I love to share Zamora of 1601's accounts, Fray Juan Pobre, he's also referred to as, and he's very romantic. And I think I tend to be romantic when I look at our ancient culture, so I like his stuff. But I just want to share here, quote, "When a man and a woman marry and live together in a house, although they have been married 20 or 30 years, if the husband is unfaithful to his wife or takes a mistress, and if it should anger his wife, she will leave the house, taking the children and all the household furniture and effects, and will go to the house of her parents or of other relatives, where she will remain. During all this time, the children will not acknowledge their father, even though he may pass very close to them." See, that shows the loyalty to the mother who owned the children, right? "Before the wife will return to the husband, his relatives will have to go to great lengths to do so. If the wife is unfaithful to the husband, her relatives do not have to go to so much lengths, because it is easier to obtain the husband's pardon, since this sin is considered less serious for the women than for the man." Right? So this is sort of the flip side in terms of adultery and when that happens. But again, you're seeing the role that the woman has, especially in terms of the children, in terms of being the person who's the steerer of the household as well. Okay, another Freycinet, and this is the one that's very popular. If you've read any of this stuff or studied anything about CHamoru and gender dynamics, you're going to have read this one. But it's also very sensational, right? And we have the perfect picture there of Tressa's auntie, Arn Solace. And so he states, quote, "All the women kept it, a spear in their hand and their husband's hat on their head. In that marital guise, they then advance as a unit on the house of the guilty man. First, they lay waste his crops and tear up his cereals, trampling them down. Then they strip his fruit trees of the fruit and create an appalling mess. Finally, they descend upon the dwelling in itself. And if the wretched husband has not taken precaution of betaking himself elsewhere and finding cover, they attack him too and chase him right out." Now, on the one hand, it's like, yes, go women, Famalawan, Biba Famalawan, right? Very empowered women that would actually execute something of this, because clearly in this account, the man is the vulnerable party here. But it also is and has components of violence, right? So these are the kinds of sort of like breadcrumb pieces that we have to look at as we try to sort through, well, were we violent? Were we not? Were we a little bit of both? And more importantly, how do we move forward into our future in such a way that we restore who we are to our best sense of self as Chamorros, right? And so this here is a picture of me, and I was probably about 14, 15 years old, and with my mother, my Nana, who's passed, rest her soul. And Tiloling is doing another edition of her book, Daughters of the Island, and she's got a number of different essays in it of what she calls a new generation of daughters. And I was able to contribute one of the essays into that publication. And so I just wanted to share a paragraph here that is really the conventional wisdom of my mother as, you know, an ordinary grassroots Chamorro woman. And so I'll quote here. I'm quoting actually myself here, but my Nana impressed upon me that while we as women were responsible for taking care of everyone and making the best decisions in the collective interest, it is equally our responsible to take care of our grandfathers, fathers, uncles, ninus, brothers, sons, and nephews. My Nana's concern was always for the clan, and this included the needs of our men. The care we provided the men in our family was not to take away from our power as women. Rather, it was to complement the tsinsuli, the reciprocal relationship that we have with them. They were our steadfast partners. They made manifest the vision we had in our minds in the service of our family. They went fishing and hunting and erected the palapalas for the dinanyas that we coordinated. They went to work and gave us their whole paychecks. They listened as we talked through making hard decisions about the finances, our children, and our elders. They cared for our children while we went about the business of building our careers. And so I share this paragraph because it really is about the complementarity and the relationship between men and women. And I think this clearly illustrates that. I have a family that I worked with. We're done now with our work, but it's a local Chamorro family from the South. And I think it's very beautiful. They're very culturally rooted. They're clear about that. And so we talked about, because the daughter, who's a young college student now, was talking about how, you know, mom is so domineering and she's so mean and she does all these things, and dad, you just let her get away with it, you know. And so my role as a therapist was then, of course, I meet with each party individually to get a sense of where they're at. And I shared that with dad. I said, you know, your daughter had shared that in our first session when we were all together. What are your thoughts and what are your feelings about that? And he says, you know, I'm going to be honest. He says, my wife, she makes better decisions than I do. And in the beginning, when we first got married, he says, I was trying to be the man of the house. He said, I made all the decisions and I made a lot of mistakes. He says, but my wife, she's so smart. She knows how to handle those things. And so I've just decided that that's her role, you know, that she can do those things in our household because she's good at it, you know. And I think part of why his wife is probably good at that is because she was trained and raised in that role, right? As most of us Chamorro women are raised. We're raised with lots of responsibility, especially in caring for the younger siblings and the babies in our families. So it's very inherent in who we are. And so Chamorros as parents. Here's another quote, more Zamora, who I love. Okay, and Zamora wrote this book, his account from when he was living in Rhoda at the time in Luta. And he states, while they are very young, they make their sons and daughters work and teach them to perform their tasks. Consequently, the very young know how to perform their tasks like their parents because they have been taught with great love. So great is their love for their children that it would take a long time to describe it and to sing it praises. They never spank them, and they even scold them with loving words. When a child is offended and angered by what is said to him, he will move a short distance away from his parents and turn his back to them, not wanting to face them. They will then toss sand or pebbles on the ground behind him, and after he has cried for a little while, one of his parents will go to him and with very tender words will take him in his arms or raise him to his shoulders and carry him back to where the others are gathered. Then they will always give him some of their best food, and speaking to them as if he were an adult, tell him how he should behave, admonishing him to be good. With such great love, these barbarians, guess it's not going to move, children, that they in turn grow up to be obedient and expert in their occupations and skills, right? This is such a beautiful account. And really what he's describing here is time out, right? But it's such a beautiful account of the respect that parents had for their children. And so when you have cases of family violence, of child abuse, and you're working with the parents, oftentimes, I mean, I'm sure it's not an unfamiliar experience where parents will say, huh, you think you're going to tell me that I can't hit my kid? That's the way I was raised. Are you telling me that my parents were wrong? And how do we respond to that, right? And then it's this whole assumption that to be abusive is to be CHamoru. And, I very gently challenge that idea in therapy all the time. And when you really develop trust with them, then you can introduce accounts like this and say, well, maybe there was another way. And maybe the abuse is secondary to all the trauma that we've experienced as a people. Okay, more of a quote. I put all the CHamoru celebrities in here. This one's Dr. Bavakwa. And so Zamora goes on to say, at the age of 4 or 5, they teach their sons to go out to sea in little boats that they build for them, and which have their own outriggers that are identical to those on their father's larger boats. By the age of 14, they've become so skilled at using them that the sons know as much as their fathers. By the time they are 16 or 18, the sons put out to sea to fish alone, as I have seen them do, alone in this funai. He sets the sails, bails the boat, and fishes with the hook and net. If it capsizes, he rights it. So great is their strength. And this really encapsulates the very beautiful relationship between CHamoru fathers and sons, right? I go to supervision with Dr. Bellis once a month, and he had shared a citation with us that proposes that in American Western culture, what did them in as men was that once industrialization happened, men were now going to the factory to work, and it severed the connection and tied between them and their sons. And we see that, right? We see that even in the context, and this clearly shows that the modeling of our young boys by their fathers is very critical. And when that was severed, not just by modernity and westernization and wage labor, which really only happened after World War II for us here on island, that separation contributes to these consequences. And of course, focusing on that because the role of the father is so critical in how we socialize our young men in terms of their respect and interaction with women. And then here's a quote by former Senator Kelly Marsh on elders. And she states, one of the first things written about Chamorro society was that mañana, or elders, were highly respected and held a lot of power. An early Spanish visitor to Guam, Fray Antonio de los Angeles in 1596, said that elders gave orders and everyone obeyed them completely. It was family elders who ruled their clans and thus ancient Chamorro society. And we know that's true because that's who ruled the clan by way of the Magalagi and the Magahaga. Right? So if we held and hold our elders with such high esteem, how do we account for 67 and 69% of the fact that the cases of elder abuse on island are perpetrated for Chamorros, right? Really important questions to ask. And so now shifting and looking at our modern social service context. Indigenous peoples' experiences of historical trauma warrants the integration of culture-based interventions to facilitate healing. Right? And you see how many different people I have cited here? Plenty of people believe this. This is not something that we should even be convincing ourselves is true. It is true. We on Guahan are late to the party in terms of integrating culture-based elements into our service delivery system. And so we look at and we advance cultural competency to move beyond that to cultural humility and ultimately cultural safety, right? So coupled with cultural competency, which we as social workers are always talking about, and cultural humility, which means we go into a situation being humble and knowing that we have a lot to learn as opposed to the opposite. Cultural safety is defined as, quote, an environment that is spiritually, socially, emotionally, and physically safe for people, where cultural identity is recognized and valued through shared respect, meaning, knowledge, and the experience of learning together, right? So when we create an environment of cultural safety with our client systems, then really that is the most fertile ground in terms of helping. But don't fret in that. Healing must take place on both the individual and collective levels to prevent intergenerational transmission of trauma, right? We're reminded of this by Pihama, Cameron, and Nana. And so basically what this is saying, and we as social workers, it means we work with clients individually one-on-one in the context of their families, in the context of their life situation. But it also means we do things like in this picture, where we do things like go to the United Nations and do at the highest level globally of advocacy for the remedying of the injustice that continues to occur with ongoing colonization. And so moving now then looking back at the agency level and looking at what kinds of strategies can agencies implement and incorporate so that we are complementary in terms of our approach to working with our client systems. You know, this spoke here on the right is stuff that is probably the only spoke that people are most implementing, and that is language access and proficiency for limited English speakers. I know the court in particular, you know, funding the class training that Mr. Al Silverio coordinates, that's all connected to this spoke right here. But that's just step one, right? And the only reason that got implemented is because the court said we can't have legal proceedings and they don't even know what's being said, right? So that's step one. But then when we look at things like personnel, and I'll just go to the top spoke, personnel whose identities reflect the demographic composition of clients. In other words, if your agency is such that the majority of clients at this point in time are Chuukese, then we need to see what we can do to get some Chuukese service providers in there, because the match in terms of cultural identity is, it catapults you 20, 30, 40% in terms of being able to be effective with your client system, because you're already at a starting point on the same page. The incorporation of cultural resources in your interventions is really critical. I'm going to be talking more about that. And then I have the acknowledgement of ancestors as part of agency protocols, right? We started our conference today with Eric Borja doing the Osaina chant, you know, and we can feel comfortable to bring that even into our healing spaces at our agencies. When I worked at Igomata, one of the things that we did was we had a little table, and I put my Nana's picture up there. Our, you know, Doris has deceased family members. We put them all up there. And that's part of just saying, this is part of our space. This represents who we are. And, you know, I would bring my new clients and introduce them to my ancestors that way. And they would share with me who their family line is and who their ancestors were. And that was very connecting. And then the last spoke here is the mechanism for consultation with the Manyaina, right? If we say our elders are so important culturally, then we need to build the advisement of our elders into our service delivery system, right? Pretty common sense, nothing rocket science. And so when we look at client system interventions, culture-based curricula utilizing indigenous ceremonies, language, and traditions, it's kind of a little bit okay to borrow a little bit from the Native Americans or from the Maoris or whatever, but really we're at the point as a community in terms of service delivery where we need to challenge ourselves to develop our own models for Chamorros, our own models for Chuukese, our own models for everybody else. Because the reality is when we import even another indigenous culture, it's still in some ways appropriating, right? So we need to challenge ourselves that way. And then focus on the total family system, right? Family group counseling is absolutely critical. Even though it's so much easier to work with just the individual, you need to pull in the family system, because as Chamorros, we are so deeply embedded in our larger system, we barely exist outside of it. So you need to integrate that into the work that we do. And then utilizing storytelling with the Manyaina and the families, right? Because we know traditionally that's just what we do. Engage stories of our ancestors. Ask them, go to your grandmother and ask her a story about her grandmother and see what they come back with. And teach decolonized history and historical accounts, right? And, like sharing those accounts from Zamora and from Freycinet. I had a client who I worked with once in private practice, and it was the most interesting thing because it was around July, and she says, you know what? The assignment was that because she had a lot of tension with her old Chamorro mother, who was very, very abusive towards her, verbally, certainly, and also physically. And she was like, she was really looking for healing, and her mom was just driving her insane. So we came up with this assignment. We said, okay, don't go to the parade. I want you to bring your mom, who was a war survivor, right? So you can understand her pain and her behavior, and take her, ask her to take you on a tour of her war experience. And they did. And they went to sites in Agate, for example, where her brother died, and she got to share that story. And she went on, and unpacked that whole experience that, you know, in so many ways really led to healing, not just of my client, but of her mother. And so some of the tools that we have at our disposal, and this is the kind of stuff that Bonnie Durant and others use in their programs, utilize the legends, the chants, the proverbs that we have as tools.
The Legend of Taga.
Okay, so we're going to listen to the Legend of Taga, which to me is very exemplary, reminiscent of family violence. And so here, I pre-recorded it because it's very long. Here we go.
According to CHamoru legend, Taga was born to the Magatlahi, or chief of Retidian village on Guahan. In the legend, Taga was a giant. Dissatisfied with his father's rule, the boy challenged his father to a fight. When Taga lost the fight, he moved to Luta, where he challenged the leading Magatlahi to a series of contests. Winning these contests, he married a local Chamorro woman and had a daughter. At As Nieves in Luta, he began excavating what would have been the largest latte stones in the Marianas. Perhaps he was trying to impress his father. For an unknown reason, however, Taga moved from Luta to Tinian without lifting the stones out of the ground. As he had on Luta, the giant Taga gained power on Tinian and had a son. He then oversaw the construction of his home, the House of Taga, on San Halom Bay on the southwest coast of the island. The house consisted of 12 latte stones with a wooden house built on top of the stones. When the son of Taga turned 5 years old, Taga gave him a giant azuzu, or coconut crab, as a present. Unfortunately, while the boy was walking the crab, it cut the twine leash and ran under a young coconut tree. The boy ran back to Taga house and asked his father to push over the coconut tree so he could get the crab. Taga refused, explaining that the coconuts were just beginning to bear fruit. The boy became furious. He ran back to the tree and shook it furiously, finally pushing over the tree himself. While the boy was pulling the crab from the hole he had just created, he noticed water. It was fresh water. He gave the well to his half-sister for her to bathe in. When Taga saw his young son perform this great feat of strength, he recognized that the boy might become bigger and stronger than even himself. He remembered fighting his own father. That night, Taga crept into the boy's room and smothered him to death. Taga's daughter saw this. She became so frightened that she ran away to the deep forest and hid. By the time she was returned to her mother, the girl was so weak that she died. Taga buried the girl in a cavity dug in one of the tasa of Taga house. This grieved the mother so much that she too died.
Okay, so all that to say, right? I mean, it's like the ultimate story in terms of family violence, and it is embedded in our legends. And so using a story like the Legend of Taga, and here are just some examples of discussion questions that can be used to process that, right? How does intergenerational paternal conflict and violence affect generations to come? How does the perpetrator of hypermasculine violence feel as a result of his or her actions? How does the emotion of anger play a role? How does fear impact our relationship? Does anger and power justify the loss of life? To what extent do you think Taga experienced regret as a result of killing his son? What impact did his behavior have on his wife, his daughter, the larger clan? How do you think his grief impacted his life, and so forth, right? So you can use this as a tool to process that experience and to learn alternative ways. Here's a proverb. Okay, and so that was just an example of a proverb that could be utilized. right? And then pulling from the curriculum that Dr. Tim De La Cruz and I wrote, one of the things that we did in one of the lessons was an Inafat Malik pledge for the family, right? And where they actually vow that because the family is important and they want Inafat Malik, these are the things that they're willing to do, right? With the guidance of our ancestors, I promise to do the following, to practice Inafat Malik in my home, right? I make this vow in the spirit of Inafat Malik and Guinaidza, right? And so these are just a snippet of examples in terms of how we can incorporate. And so here's a training activity, even though we're quite over time. On a scale of 1 to 10, ask yourself, how culturally competent would you say your professional practice is? And provide reasons for your assessment. And number 2, what legends, chants, songs, or cultural resources can you use in your work with your youth? With youth and families when conducting supportive counseling, support groups, and treatment planning with your client systems. And, 5 examples is ambitious, but there it is, right? Okay, so I guess not so bad. We've got 9 minutes for Q&A. That's all I have for my presentation. I'm going to close my PowerPoint here, stop my screen share, and if there's any questions, we can discuss those. You can just unmute if you have any questions.
You can unmute yourself or write the questions you have in the chat. We can also include any comments you have.
Thank you, Sage Beneventi.
Looks like we don't have any questions at the moment, but I do have one comment. I liked that you said we are land, land is us. It makes us feel more connected to the earth we live on and enables us to pay more attention to issues such as climate change and other environmental topics.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And that's why part of what we do as social workers in the, through the value of social justice that's critical for us is to defend our land, right? Is to defend our land. I'm so proud of the fact that to be a social work student now, you just have to get comfortable with holding a protest sign, right? That's a beautiful thing, because I tell you, the first time we started doing protests in our program, the students would look at me like I was absolutely insane, right? But getting comfortable in that skin, because we have to protect what's outside. So we're doing, I think it was Jamila earlier was sharing in her video recording about the multiple levels of practice, right? Individual all the way to macro, but we really are obliged to operate at all fronts. I see a question here from Malia. Okay, Malia, are you from the CNMI? Okay, just curious. Okay, so she asks, what do you think are the varying factors that contribute to family violence in the CNMI? It's hard for me to answer that question because I don't practice primarily in the CNMI, but I do work with their CPS out there. I actually started working with the kids doing their therapy about maybe less than a year ago. And I think there's a lot of different factors that play a role, very similar to ours and different, right? So I think that they tend to be a little bit more closed in terms of understanding that family violence is not acceptable behavior. And there's less of, there is a family violence, what is it called? A coalition. There is a coalition against violence in the CNMI, and they're doing really great work in terms of shifting the cultural trends, where there's violence and so forth. But, it's an uphill struggle. And they as a community have a lot less resources in comparison to Guahan in terms of services that are available. And I think that's another factor that makes it difficult. But they do also tend to have a little bit more of the family system in place. And as a matter of fact, the kids that I work with who are in the shelter in the CNMI, about half of them actually have their links to Guahan that are originally from here, and the families move there. And so when abuse happens, there isn't the extended family system to take the kids in, and so they end up in the shelter. But I'm sorry, I don't have more definitive response in that regard. This PowerPoint presentation was taken from a chapter that I've written for a book that should be published later this year. And the book is looking at culture across the Marianas. And so that's why I included the CNMI, because I didn't want, political lines to divide us, right? We want to be unified. And so I wanted to include them in the chapter because of course they're Chamorro up north in the Northern Islands as well. But I'm certainly no expert in terms of understanding their community, other than to say that, we're really all in this struggle together because their story is our story, right? Our land is connected and we literally truly are one in terms of a lot of the experiences and struggles. So I think it's very similar of an experience. So thank you for that question, Malia. Okay, no other questions? Shall we call it a day? We got 4 minutes till 4 o'clock. I think we lost our moderator.
If there's no questions or comments, you guys can exit this track and go to the main break room, where you guys can just stay in this track until I think about 4:05. We'll conclude the day 1 of the conference.
Okay, so Zeus Masi, Joss.